The courtroom was colder than it needed to be, like the air conditioning had been cranked just to make the silence sting. Warren Buffett sat still in his chair, hands folded, face unreadable. It was rare to see him in a suit that wasn't comforting, no folksy smile, no cherry coke in hand. Just a man being tried not for crimes of greed or fraud, but for something murkier, negligence in oversight. A small investment subsidiary under his umbrella had been accused of regulatory misconduct, and even though Buffett himself hadn't signed a single paper involved, the headlines didn't care. The name Buffett was big enough to carry guilt without proof. The judge, Charles Dawson, was a former prosecutor turned federal circuit judge with a reputation for being brutally direct, especially with corporate defendants. He didn't like charm. He didn't like excuses. And he definitely didn't like billionaires who, in his eyes, had grown too used to walking above the rules. From the moment the trial began, Dawson's tone was harsh. Every time Buffett spoke, the judge interrupted. When the defense presented documents, Dawson questioned their convenient accuracy. During cross-examinations, his glares landed heavier than the questions themselves. It wasn't just judicial formality, it was personal. And everyone in the courtroom felt it. The verdict wasn't criminal. But it might as well have been. Buffett's firm was hit with a massive fine, and though he avoided direct liability, the ruling effectively accused him of willful blindness, a phrase that echoed across the financial world like a scarlet stamp. Berkshire Hathaway's stock didn't crash, not immediately, but it slid. Quietly, steadily. Investors pulled back, critics sharpened their knives, and op-eds began questioning whether the Oracle of Omaha had finally run out of wisdom. For the first time in decades, Warren Buffett was not the example, he was the warning. He didn't respond publicly. No press conferences, no interviews. Just a brief, dignified statement through his office: "We accept the court's ruling and will continue to uphold the values of transparency and accountability." Behind the scenes, he was disappointed. Not at the ruling. Buffett had seen markets turn colder than courts. But at the tone of it. The lack of proportionality. The judge had treated him like a caricature, not a man with a lifetime of steady hands and cautious steps. Still, Warren moved on. Quietly, as always. He returned to work, reduced his public appearances, and focused more on his philanthropic efforts. If the world wanted to paint him as a fallen king, so be it. He had no interest in a redemption tour. 6 months passed. The media cycle moved on. Tech CEOs got caught in scandals. A banking startup imploded. Someone else became the center of attention. But behind the walls of Judge Dawson's own life, a storm had begun brewing. His daughter, 17, had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition, aggressive, unpredictable, and astronomically expensive to treat. The judge did what any father would: he dropped everything. Between hearings, he was in and out of hospitals, research centers, consulting specialists from 3 states. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. He and his wife drained their savings. Friends and colleagues helped, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, Dawson, the stern voice of courtroom order, found himself doing something he never thought he would: applying for assistance. A private referral led him to one of the most reliable grant foundations in the country, one known for helping families in medical crisis without the media spotlight. It had a reputation for discretion, speed, and integrity. The paperwork was long, but he filled it out carefully, humbled. He never looked too closely at the name at the top of the letterhead. Just focused on the part that said, Medical Relief Program Critical Need Review. A week later, the request hit the desk of a senior coordinator. She read the name. Paused. Then walked the form straight to Warren Buffett's office. That he read it once. Then again. He didn't flinch. Just nodded. "Have we ever helped a judge before?" he asked quietly. "Not knowingly," she said. "But he didn't realize this was your foundation." Buffett thought for a long moment, tapping the corner of the folder with his index finger. Then he said, "Tell him we'll meet." The email was brief. It came from a foundation representative named Daniel Merrick. No title. No fanfare. Just a calm request to meet in person regarding the funding application. Judge Charles Dawson read it twice. The tone was respectful. Not cold, not enthusiastic. Just neutral. Like everything in his life lately. He replied immediately, accepting the invitation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in a discreet office suite just outside Lincoln, Nebraska. Strange choice, but not one he questioned. When you're desperate, you don't haggle with coordinates. His wife offered to come. He said no. He didn't want her to see him like this, hopeful, uncertain, vulnerable. The plane was quiet. The drive quieter. As he arrived at the address, an unmarked building with shaded windows and no receptionist, he double-checked the calendar invite on his phone. Still there. Still confirmed. He walked in, expecting a small team, maybe a lawyer or two. What he didn't expect was him, Warren Buffett, sitting alone at a polished wooden table in a quiet, sunlit room. For a second, Dawson thought he was hallucinating. His first instinct was disbelief. His second was panic. His third, shame. A deep, sour kind that settled in his throat like a stone. Please, Warren said, not rising, just gesturing calmly to the chair across from him. Have a seat. Dawson sat, stiff, unsure whether to speak first. I heard about your daughter, Buffett said softly. I'm very sorry. Silence stretched between them. The kind that didn't ask to be filled, just felt. Finally, Dawson cleared his throat. I didn't know this was your foundation. If I had, I wouldn't have. Warren raised a hand gently. But you did. And I'm glad you did. That's what it's there for. Another long pause. Then, quietly, you probably think I don't deserve your help. Buffett leaned back slightly, resting his arms on the table. This isn't about deserve. It's about whether I believe in what we're doing. And I do. Helping people. That's never been conditional. Not even for people who don't particularly like me. Dawson looked down. I didn't treat you fairly in court. Warren didn't blink. You treated me like someone you didn't trust. That's not the same thing as injustice. But it was personal. The judge exhaled, slowly. I let my bias speak louder than the facts. You weren't on trial. Not really. Your name was. I know, Buffett said. And you still agreed to this? I did, Warren replied. But not blindly. The air shifted. Buffett reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a statement, legal, direct, and detailed. At the top, motion to reopen ruling section 18B, reassessment of oversight conclusions. Dawson blinked. You're appealing. I'm asking for something fair, Warren said calmly. A reconsideration of the language. The judgment stood, but the interpretation, the legacy, can still be amended. You know what I mean. The judge's mouth was dry. You want me to reverse myself? No, Buffett said gently. I want you to look again. This time, without the weight of assumption. And in return, my foundation will fully fund your daughter's treatment. Regardless of your decision. The motion is yours to decide. The donation that's already in process. Dawson looked up sharply. Then why even bring it up? Because I want you to understand something. Warren's voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. I don't want revenge. I don't need vindication. But I do believe in repair. And sometimes, repair requires truth. The full kind. Dawson stared at the folder. I'll read it, he said. But not because of the money. I know, Warren replied, standing. Because of your daughter. He walked to the door, then paused, hand resting on the handle. I've spent a lifetime believing in compound interest, he said without turning. Turns out, it works on grace too. The sooner you invest, the more it grows. And then he left. The judge sat alone, the folder in his hands, the room still warm with sunlight but cold with thought. The folder sat on Charles Dawson's desk for 3 days before he opened it. He had placed it between 2 stacks of unrelated case briefs, hoping that the simple act of hiding it might help him avoid what it carried. But he couldn't. Not with his daughter sleeping across the hall with a treatment schedule written in hours, not days. Not with the memory of Warren Buffett's voice echoing in that room, calm, steady, completely absent of anger. That was the part that disturbed him the most. Buffett hadn't demanded anything. Hadn't threatened. He had simply placed the truth on the table and walked away. That kind of grace was harder to ignore than any attack. On the 4th night, when the house was quiet and the hum of the refrigerator sounded like courtroom silence, Dawson finally reached for the folder. He read the motion line by line, not like a judge, but like a man trying to understand something he missed the first time. The details were surgical. The timelines exact. But it wasn't the facts that shook him, it was the absence of arrogance in how they were presented. There were no words meant to embarrass the court. No passive-aggressive swipes. Just data, context, and a single quiet point. Buffett hadn't been negligent. He had been careful. Careful in the way most people never notice, because good leadership often looks like nothing at all. Quiet oversight. Delegated trust. A system that works unless someone is looking for a headline instead of an answer, and Dawson had been looking for a headline. He knew that now. Back then, the case had been the biggest name to pass through his courtroom in years. There had been pressure. Media attention. Political eyes. And something personal, too, something he hadn't been proud of. A father's resentment, maybe, toward men who seemed to live without consequence. Dawson hadn't known Buffett's full history, only the version the public carried in their pockets. The billionaire. The investor. The untouchable. He didn't see the discipline, the caution, the pattern of a man who had turned down luxury to build something boring, steady, and clean. That realization sat heavy on his chest. The next morning, he didn't go to chambers. Instead, he drove his daughter to the hospital himself. They didn't talk much during the drive. She was tired. He was somewhere else entirely. But when they arrived, the nurse handed him an envelope at the front desk. Inside was confirmation of the first installment. The foundation had covered the cost in full. No ceremony. No signature. Just paid. That same day, the case file he had reopened was stamped with a private note, to be reviewed at judge's discretion. Dawson took it home. He didn't assign a clerk. He didn't send it to committee. He sat with it. Thought about the ripple effects. What it would mean to revisit something the public had already absorbed as settled truth. But Buffett had been right. The verdict stood. The legal part was over. This was about something else, how things are remembered. And whether a man could quietly correct his own misstep without asking the world to cheer. A week later, in a private ruling, Dawson issued a written clarification. He did not reverse the original outcome. The fine against the subsidiary remained. But he rewrote the language surrounding Buffett's role, striking the phrase, willful blindness, and replacing it with, lack of direct oversight without intent or knowledge. It was dry. Legal. Surgical. But to anyone paying attention, it was a retraction. A quiet admission. A way of telling the world, we got the tone wrong, and that matters. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't notify the press, but Warren Buffett read the update the same day it was filed. The senior coordinator from the foundation handed him the printout in his office. He read it once, then placed it in his drawer. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He just nodded once. Across town, Charles Dawson received a short envelope in the mail. Inside was a card. No return address. Just 5 words, handwritten in calm, looping script: thank you for reconsidering clearly. That was it, but the story didn't stay private for long. A journalist at a financial review site noticed the court filing and connected the dots. The Buffett Foundation's donation had been confidential, but someone leaked it anonymously not to embarrass the judge, but to highlight the chain of events. The story broke slowly. It didn't trend. It didn't explode. But it spread quietly, like a whisper that people leaned in to hear. The billionaire who helped the man who once ruled against him. Not for revenge. Not for leverage. Just because it was right. And because he believed that some people, even when they get it wrong, still want to make it right. In interviews, Buffett declined to comment. He said everything that needed saying had already been said or done. But when asked later at a shareholders' meeting if he believed in second chances, he answered with the same simplicity that had defined his whole career: "I believe in long games. Even with people." The room didn't applaud. They didn't need to. Some truths don't ask to be clapped for. They just asked to be carried forward. Spring came slow that year. Not because the weather was late, but because time had taken on a different rhythm for both Warren Buffett and Judge Dawson. For the judge, days moved between hospital visits and quiet reflection. His daughter had responded to the first rounds of treatment better than expected. She smiled more. Her appetite returned. She started asking about school again. For a man who had once built a life out of rulings and footnotes, her questions were the only ones that mattered now. As for Buffett, he was back in his old routine: early mornings, coffee with numbers, reading 5 newspapers a day, lunch at the same modest diner he'd eaten at for decades. The world was catching up to him now, not in terms of wealth, but in how it had begun to notice that restraint, not volume, was what left the deepest imprint. There were still meetings, still deals, still foundation letters to sign, but something in him had shifted. Maybe not changed. Warren had never been a man of sudden reinvention, but settled. As if something unbalanced had finally, quietly clicked back into place. Then one afternoon, about 2 months after the judge's correction had been filed, Buffett's assistant walked in holding a small white envelope. No branding. No forwarding address. Just his name, handwritten. Inside was a single page. A letter. From Dawson. It wasn't long. The judge wrote that his daughter's health had stabilized. That she was laughing again. That he'd thought long and hard about the choice Warren had made, not to help out of revenge, not to leverage an old wound, but to extend something rarely seen anymore: mercy without publicity. He admitted that when he first saw Buffett at that table, he felt fear. But the deeper emotion, he said, had been shame. Shame not because of the verdict itself, but because of how coldly it had been delivered. "I treated you as a symbol," the letter read, "and forgot to look at you as a man." He closed with one sentence Warren would later frame quietly in his office, never telling anyone he'd done so: "Justice without humility isn't justice at all, just control wearing a robe." No one else ever saw the letter. It wasn't meant for the press, but word of what had happened between Buffett and Dawson continued to circulate in certain circles, not sensationalized, not turned into a headline, just passed along in private conversations as one of those rare stories people almost didn't believe, because it felt too honest. There were no press releases. No staged forgiveness. Just 2 men who had collided in a courtroom, then quietly found a better version of themselves in the aftermath. That summer, the Buffett Foundation quietly expanded its medical relief program. No fanfare. Just a broader scope and a few new partners. Among them was a newly launched legal initiative to help judges and attorneys with family health cost structure to keep applicants anonymous, just as Dawson had once hoped to be. It was funded entirely by a new endowment Warren added personally. He named it Grace 18. No one asked him what the number meant. But if you looked it up, you'd find that the original case filed against Buffett had been stamped Section 18B. Maybe it was a reminder. Or maybe it was his way of rewriting the number, one layer of meaning at a time. The final ripple came in Omaha. At a small economic ethics panel hosted at a local university, Buffett was asked during a Q&A session what he believed was the most valuable lesson he'd ever learned in business. He paused, then said, that the most expensive mistake a person can make isn't losing money. It's thinking they'll never need forgiveness from someone they once misunderstood. The room was silent for a long moment. No applause. No follow-up question, just stillness. Later that night, as Warren walked out into the warm Nebraska dusk, his assistant asked if he wanted a card. He shook his head. No. I think I'll walk. And he did slowly, calmly, down a quiet street, his steps soft, unhurried, the air filled with nothing but crickets and the kind of silence a man earns when he stops needing to win and simply starts listening, because that was the return, not to wealth. Not to reputation, but to himself. Months passed. The news cycle shifted. Bigger headlines pushed the story of Buffett and the judge into the background. Most people never even knew it happened. But in the quiet places, boardrooms, legal offices, hospitals, the story still moved. Not loudly. Not quickly. But it moved. Buffett never mentioned it again in public. He never needed to. Those who understood, understood. And those who didn't. He wasn't trying to win them. He wasn't that kind of man. He didn't measure impact by applause. He measured it by what changed when no one was looking. Judge Dawson eventually stepped down. Not under pressure. Not in scandal. He said his daughter's recovery gave him a new sense of time, how precious it was, how fast it slipped. He wanted to spend the rest of it where it mattered most. At home. At his farewell reception, someone asked him what case had shaped him the most. He paused, gave a faint smile, and said, "It wasn't a case. It was a conversation." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Warren heard about the retirement through someone else. Sent a note. Simple. Respectful. "Time is the rarest capital," it said. "Spend it well." The following year, at the annual shareholders' meeting in Omaha, someone in the back asked Buffett if he believed kindness had a role in finance. He paused, then answered, "Kindness without wisdom is sentiment. But wisdom without kindness is dangerous." Then he looked down at the paper in front of him and said nothing else. That was his way, and perhaps that's why the story stayed with the few who knew it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. 2 men. 1 decision. And the quiet, human cost of being wrong, then choosing to make it right. Not every story needs a spotlight to matter, some just need a second chance.